creatively, this will make a little bit sense later, titled today's session, You've Never Talked to a Mere Bobblehead. Trust me, that'll make a little sense. It's kind of playing on something with Jamie Smith and C.S. Lewis. So we are going to be doing today our fourth of our grid. Over the past few weeks, we've looked at this quote multiple times from Francis Schaeffer: "A worldview is the basic way an individual looks at life. It's the grid through which he sees the world." And as I've said, we have a grid that we like to use, and it's these series of questions. I did, by the way, change the color scheme, if you notice, because these never show up on the videos because it's just too much light coming out. And so hopefully these will show up for people that choose to watch it online. But we have these 7 categories that we're kind of making our way through each week, and this week we're dealing with the third of the grid categories, the third strand, dealing with humanity. Anthropology, what does it mean to be human? And these are the different questions that go with those. As I said last time, that each of these categories, Christians have answers to these foundational questions. For instance, how should everything be? Christians have an answer to that question. We have an understanding of the way things should be. And taking our answer to that question, Christians then, as we apply it to our context as thinkers in the context of our schools, are we pursuing, celebrating, and resting in God's original intent? And we'll unpack that in a couple weeks. This week, though, we're dealing with the question of anthropology. So what does it mean to be human? Well, Christians believe that humans are created in God's image. By the way, that is a statement that you often hear Christian schools talk about. Image bearers, created in God's image. But often I feel that's one of the many things that I would kind of chalk up as Christian lingo. And whenever I try to say, well, what does that mean? We're all over the place. We've got hundreds of different definitions for what we mean when we say image bearers. But as Christians, we need to be asking that question: are we honoring the full image of God in all members of our school community? And so we're going to zone in on that question today. Are we honoring the full image of God in every member of our school community? And that would include the people sort of on the concentric circle outside our school that maybe our school touches. Are we honoring them as image bearers? So when we say, well, this image bearer thing, and how do Christians look at what it means to be humans, you kind of have to take a step back and think about the fact that God created. The great I Am, as we see that in Exodus 3, the Nicene Creed tells us that He made all things visible and invisible. And I like that language. He didn't just make the visible things, He made the invisible things as well. But all those things, and this kind of builds off the creator-creation distinction that we talked about last week, that everything God made was good. God can't make bad things. I realize I'm saying there are certain things God can't do. But God can't make bad things. Because, well, let's even deal with that for a second. And we'll certainly get there more when we unpack the category of the fall. What is the danger of saying God makes bad things? There's a huge danger.
Then you place moral culpability on God.
Then God is guilty for bad things. And God's not good. Like God's maybe sort of like maybe a Hinduistic kind of both good and evil. Like you see both of those in God. Huge, huge, huge problem. Now, and the Bible says He didn't make sin. And we'll have to deal kind of with that when we get to the fall. But if you say that God is responsible for sin, then God actually culpable. We've got big problems. All things God makes also is dependent. They also have value, purpose, and beauty, and they're finite. They're limited. I mean, everything God makes has value. Now, personally, I struggle with the idea that mosquitoes have value.
They're not a product of the fall?
Maybe. Yeah, I mean, goodness, maybe they're part of just the food chain, like to sustain a food chain. But apart from that, I'm just like, they have value? Well, I mean, if God makes something, if, once again, the maker of all things visible and invisible believed in mosquitoes enough to create them, then they certainly must have some kind of value and some kind of purpose. And you're like, and beauty? Well, I'm kind of getting into beauty in terms of this, that they're good, they're appropriate. So you get this word in Ecclesiastes 3 where the writer, we think it's Solomon. Solomon says that God makes everything beautiful in its time, or appropriate, or fitting, that everything fits in its right place. So the Bible tells us when we talk about God's creation that these are the categories of everything God has made. And when you specifically get to mankind, to people, we then kind of apply those same things, that man is a finite creation. He's not God. We are created by God, which means that you, once again, as we talked about last week, there is a creator-creation distinction. He's created good. He's ruled by a sovereign God. God created ex nihilo. Now you get the dust of the ground, but once again, still very much like life. Where did life come from? Out of cells. Created out of the goodness of God, not need. Created joyfully. And he was given something to do. He wasn't just stuck in the garden. He was given purpose. Name animals, tend the garden, make it beautiful. And by the way, when you read and I've referenced this before, when you read the way the Bible talks about the creation of mankind, or anything, in fact, it is a very different feel to it than when you read creation myths from, let's say, the Greeks or the Egyptians or whomever else, where the gods and mankind was created almost out of like strife and conflict to fix some kind of need. God didn't need us. He created us out of joy, out of goodness. And the Bible also tells us, we get this from the very beginning of Genesis, that God says, let us make man in our own image. And it says, in the image of God, He created them both male and female. So there's even distinction in terms of you see gender there in Genesis 1 and 2. Now, I don't think it would be ridiculous of me to say this is an exhaustive list, but when I read different theologians, people that know far more than I, talk about what it means to be created in God's image. What does that mean? We're obviously not talking about the way we look, because we know God is not this anthropomorphized being. So being in God's image isn't just a physical thing, because, once again, that's a big problem, because if being created in God's image is about our physical body, then a human being born, missing an arm, is not in God's image. We got big problems there. That image bearerness, if I could make a word out of that, most theologians would say that it deals with these categories in one way or another, that we are rational beings like God. This is something that we share with God. We image Him as rational beings. We image Him as relational beings, as spiritual beings, as moral beings, and as creative beings. And like even this relational thing, how do you know that God is relational? And I would say this, eternally relational. Yeah. The Trinity. God didn't become relational when He made people. The way Jesus prays in the high priestly prayer of John 17, he talks to His Father and says, glorify me now as I have glorified you throughout all eternity. It's basically like, so this Father and Son and the Spirit too, they've been spending all eternity glorifying each other. God is this relational God. He's a rational God. He's spiritual, and we are too. He's a moral God, knowing the difference between right and wrong. He's a creative God. This piece right there, G.K. Chesterton says that art, creativity, more than anything else, is the stamp of the divine upon man. Little episode in his book, The Everlasting Man, which puts Jesus in the history of mankind. So we talk about cavemen. These are the earliest humans. And, you have like Geico commercials where the cavemen are kind of these barbaric beings. They're really hairy and they grunt and all those kind of things. And Chesterton kind of plays with this idea. He's like, we have these ideas. They grunt. The men hit their women over the heads with a club and drag her into the cave, and that's kind of the courtship. But we talk about the earliest humans living in caves. Well, why do we believe that humans lived in caves? Like the earliest prehistoric people, they lived in caves. Why do we believe they lived in caves? Because there's art on walls. Not clubs that are notched with the names of the women they've hit over the head. With art. That the earliest proof of humanity, man was an artist. Now, the atheistic anthropologists, they want to talk about man evolving, and they need, in order to prove their points, they need to say that man at one point was a whole lot less like a human than man is today. But what do we see? We see that man, from the earliest records we have, that man saw creation as beautiful. And Chesterton, I think, is beautiful where he says this, that maybe the reason he drew on caves is because that was actually the nursery, and he wanted to draw pictures on the caves for the little kiddos. But man has always been a profoundly creative being. And you say, well, I'm not that creative. Well, okay, creative means more than just your ability to draw. It could be in the way you tell a story. Some people have the knack. I mean, the way they tell stories, it's like they just get it. Like they have the right timing and all the things to tell a story, and you just say, just keep talking. Creativity could be in terms of your ability to compose a song, a poem. It's any time that you take an idea in your head and you bring it to life. It's creative. And for no reason other, and you say, well, how's that necessarily unique? I mean, don't some animals create? They build like homes which are very like symmetrical, like, my goodness. Like you look at the structure of a beehive and you think, wow, that has to be so intricately designed, but it's for a purpose. Like it's like the art of other species is functional. Humans make art for no reason at all other than joy. I just want to do something because I find joy in it. And actually we see that in God. God didn't need to make us. He did it for joy. But like God, we're relational. I mean, I think, and I would say that when we talk about being created in God's image, we have free choice in all of these things. God gave us a measure of control and a desire for truth, beauty, and goodness. We long for those things. But you think about even this relational. Have you all seen the movie Castaway, the Tom Hanks? Who's Wilson?
The ball.
The ball.
Yeah. Volleyball.
The volleyball. And what happens to the main character when the volleyball floats away?
He's lost. He's
Desperate, lost, grieved. I mean, he's broken over a ball because he needed relationship. We are not made to not have relationship. And even if it's a volleyball, that's why kids have, imaginary friends and pet rocks and all these different things, because we need relationship. We're spiritual beings. We crave something greater than ourselves. And you see the writer of Ecclesiastes say this, that God has put eternity into our hearts. Blaise Pascal said that all of us are created with a God-shaped vacuum. That all people are rational, relational, spiritual, moral, creative, and those are things that you just can't take away. Years ago, this would be more than 20 years ago, I had the pleasure of working with a student who had severe autism. Like she was on the furthest end of the spectrum. So much so that she was non-communicative. Up until age 16, she had never uttered a single word to her parents. And at age 16, her parents somehow took her to another city, flew her pretty much across the country, and had her meet with a specialist, and the specialist strapped her down to a chair and strapped her hands down to a keyboard, because she was violent, essentially. And her parents, I remember hearing her parents tell me that having a pet would have been easier than her, because at least a pet you could train. And this girl at age 16, when they strapped her down to a laptop or a computer and began to ask her questions, her hands just went crazy. And she just started typing and they couldn't stop her. What they said is that she had the capacity to do math problems that were more complex than anybody in the entire center could give her. Like she was doing advanced calculus. She spoke multiple languages fluently and had a very vibrant person inside her. And when they actually asked her, "Where did you learn all these things?" she just wrote simply, "The truth taught me." Inside of her was a very powerfully spiritual human. I met her when she was 18. 2 years after she had learned, and she would come to youth group. I was a youth pastor at a church in California, and she would come to youth group, and I'd be teaching, and she would be there like typing as I was teaching. They're like, wait, she's typing something, and they would read what she would be typing, and as they'd be reading it, they'd peer over, she'd like throw an elbow, and then she'd be getting up. We'd have to go wrestle her and sit her back down, and she would sit down and say, "I'm so sorry." Like, she has profound dignity. And it's not necessarily something that you can always see. This is one of the reasons why Christians historically have fought for the sanctity of life. Because of being a child, an infant, has dignity, not because of what they may be able to communicate, but because they're created in the image of God. It's the same reason for like a geriatric, someone who's lost the capacity. That person still has profound value because that image bearerness can never be taken away. Sometimes it may not even be seen. We believe these things to be true. When we talk about relationship, that we have a relationship with God, we would say that's kind of our vertical relationship. We also have horizontal relationships. You know, you could say it's like a neighborly relationship, a romantic relationship to nature, relationship to self. And by the way the Bible talks about this, all of those were working perfectly. The last statement of Genesis 2, so sin enters the world in Genesis 3. When the last statement of Genesis 2 is the man and his wife were naked and they felt no shame. I can't even fathom that. This idea of no shame. But we also know, and we'll get to the fall, one of the grid questions later, but once this relationship starts to break down, it shatters this stuff. The reason why we have value is because of the image of the one who created us. Sort of other little movie thing. Toy Story 4. Have y'all seen Toy Story 4 yet? This little girl, out of some trash, she makes a toy. You remember the name of the toy? Forky. She makes a toy out of a plastic spork. And Woody the cowboy says, "You have value, even though you think you're trash. You have value because there's a little girl over there who loves you." I mean, it's like, how could we be even more theologically profound than that? What gives a person value isn't their capacity to like, look at all these great things I can do or not be able to do, like this girl I met in California. It's because of the one in whose image we are created. Another big thing, so we get that very specific language about who humans are. We're image bearers. But the Bible also gives us this really interesting, you could say, offices that it tells us what we were designed to do. So it tells us who we are, but it also tells us who we were designed to be in terms of what we're supposed to do. with our call, who we are, getting more to our calling. So, this is this big theological framework. It's called prophet, priest, and king, and I don't think I ever heard this until I was in college. Here's where this comes from. There are two perfect men in the Bible. Who are those two perfect men? Well, perfect, like perfect. Never sinned. Never sinned. Well, not never sinned, but at least for a moment, perfect. One's a real simple answer. Two, Jesus. Who's the other one? Adam. Okay, Adam and Jesus. I mean, there are people in the Bible that we never see. You know, Daniel, we don't ever get like a specific statement of his sin. But he's human, like he was a sinner. But we know Adam, for a time, was perfect. Jesus, the second Adam, the Bible calls him the second Adam, was also perfect. Both Adam and Jesus held these offices of prophet, priest, and king. And a lot of theologians who know far more about any of this stuff than I do would say, if you have two perfect human beings, well, Eve too. So two men, one woman. If you have three people that existed perfect and they held the office of prophet, priest, and king, it's not unreasonable to say that we also were designed to carry the offices of prophet, priest, and king. Because if that's what perfect people were designed to be, then maybe we were supposed to be that. And you're like, okay, well, help me understand this thing called prophet, priest, and king. Okay, the role of a prophet was to speak God's truth. Prophets don't just tell the future, they speak God's truth. I mean, sometimes, Jeremiah would just come to them and say, here's what God says, and it's about right now. It's not just the future. The role of the priest was to mediate righteousness. People would bring their sacrifice to the temple, and the priest would stand there and receive the sacrifice and would be a mediator for righteousness among the people. He would be a representative of the people to God. So when the priest went behind the curtain into the Holy of Holies, he wasn't doing it just as himself. He was representing all of the Jews. He was a representative. And the role of a king is to rule with justice. Now, we can talk about Jesus for a second. This one's pretty easy. If the role of the prophet is to priest king, or if the role of the prophet was to speak truth, how's Jesus a prophet? Pretty simple. What did Jesus walk around doing? He spoke truth all the time. Like, he walked around speaking truth. And sometimes he told about the future, but a lot of times he just says, here's the truth you need to hear. And often it would punch people in the face. They didn't want to hear what Jesus had to say to them. Well, how's Jesus priest? He's the mediator. And the writer of Hebrews, go look at Hebrews 7 and 8. It does a wonderful job of actually explaining how Jesus is the great high priest. It's interesting in Hebrews 4, it says that not only is he a great high priest, he's a high priest like Melchizedek. And you're like, well, who's that guy? Well, Melchizedek was a priest that Abraham met. I mean, in Midian, in the middle of nowhere. Well, actually, it's not the middle of nowhere. He's the priest of Salem. He was the king of Salem and high priest to God. That was his natal. So Abraham meets him. This is before, the covenant people have even been established. Abraham meets this guy named Melchizedek, who's the king of Salem and the high priest of God before God's people even exist. You're like, Salem, what is that? Okay, Jerusalem. There was the prehistoric Jerusalem. He's the king of Jerusalem and he's the high priest of God Most High. And you're like, what in the world is going on? And the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus was a priest, not in the order of Aaron, but he's a priest in the order of Melchizedek. He's a king priest. It's really cool. And the role of the priest was to rule, or the king was to rule with justice. And you see, this idea that Jesus is a king. He says it bold-faced to Pontius Pilate. When Pontius Pilate says, are you a king? He goes, I'm a king, but I'm not a king of this world. I mean, it's just beautiful. I mean, it's pretty easy to understand how Jesus is prophet, priest, and king. And then you say, okay, but Adam and Eve, we can probably do the king first. That one's pretty easy. How were Adam and Eve king? Or queen? They were created to rule, to have dominion. Okay, what about prophet? How were they prophet? How do you know they were speaking truth? Well, they weren't sinners, so everything that came out of their mouth was true. Also, what was one of the sort of speaking tasks that God gave Adam? Naming the animals. Okay, that is very kind of prophetic, that he is speaking the mind of God over, and that's ruling, that's dominion, but he's speaking as he's doing it. He's assigning names to things. And you know he's speaking truth to his wife too, and then speaking truth back and forth, because when Satan comes to Eve in Genesis 3 and says, hey, you're supposed to eat of this fruit. Why don't you eat this fruit? She says, I'm not supposed to. Well, that command was given before Eve was even created. So where did she hear that? Her husband would have said, okay, we're a prophet here. Speaking God's word to his wife, and she would have been speaking it back, I mean, because they're perfect. But then you get into this issue of priest, and there's this fascinating book on protology by a seminary professor named John Fesco, where he says we actually need to rethink the way we think about the Garden of Eden. Fesco says that the Garden of Eden was the first temple. You're like, first temple? That's kind of weird. I just thought it was some garden. He says not only was it the first temple, that the whole Bible is about the temple, the perfect temple of the garden, a flawed temple, and then the temple in the New Jerusalem that John sees in Revelation. Like, well, how is the Garden of Eden a temple? Well, maybe this will fire you up with some similarities. Where would you expect, if you were going to go on a hunt for the Garden of Eden, what kind of ground would you look for the Garden of Eden? Like, what kind of topography? Where would you try to find it? Okay, in the Fertile Crescent. But even are we talking in a valley, on a mountain, on just the side of a river? Okay, maybe on the side. Why? Availability of water. Okay. Well, I didn't even think about this until someone said, go actually look at what it says. Okay, what direction does water always flow? Regardless of the hemisphere? Down. 4 rivers flowed out of the Garden of Eden. So most likely, where is it? Lifted up. Yeah. Well, you start looking at things. What direction did the Garden of Eden face? It faced the east. How do you know? Because when God put cherubim there, he put them on the east, the entrance to the garden. What direction was the temple always supposed to face? The east. When John sees the New Jerusalem, the temple coming, he sees it coming from the west, so what direction is it facing? The east. What kind of land was the temple put on? The Temple Mount. John saw the new temple, when it gets established, high and lifted up. What was in the center of the Garden of Eden? A tree. Okay. If you actually look at the old tabernacle, and I know some of y'all actually, all the little things like the Ark of the Covenant and the table of showbread and the altar of incense and the golden lampstand, all those kind of things. If you were to actually look at it like bird's eye view, what's in the middle of it? The Ark of the Covenant's at the back. What would be in the middle of the different objects that were in the temple? Well, it's the golden lampstand. What was the golden lampstand supposed to look like? It had almond blossoms on it. It was made to look like a tree. What's in the New Jerusalem? The tree of life. A tree's in the middle of it. And water comes out of the middle of the city. And then you start going, and what was supposed to be on the walls of the temple? They're gold, but what's carved into them is pomegranates and palm trees and almonds and all these things. You're going, very vegetative. And when Adam sinned, what did God put at the entrance to keep the sin of Adam from the presence of God? What did God put there at the entrance? With flaming swords. Angels. You go into the temple, what's there guarding the presence of humans from the Ark of the Covenant? A veil that's knitted all throughout with angels. You start going, I'm starting to kind of see some frameworks here. I don't think it's a coincidence that the temple that the people worshiped in was supposed to do two things: to point back to the way we were supposed to be and what we one day will be. We were made to exist with God in the temple. And also, what was the whole purpose of the temple? What was it supposed to demonstrate to the people? You see this, that God is supreme, and this idea of God with us. Actually, John 1, where it says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, the best word in terms of became flesh and dwelt among us is He tabernacled among us. The presence of God. So, and by the way, how do you know that God was present in the temple? Well, you see this cloud. How do you know God was present in the Garden of Eden? There's this interesting statement. Well, His voice was there, but we also know He was present there. There's this weird kind of little statement about God in the garden. At least daily He was doing something. He's going for a walk with Adam. You start going, so God's present there? So, wow. And what was that? Adam would, you could say, represent all of creation before God in the temple. Like, that to me sounds like priest. We were created to be prophet, priest, and king. And then you start thinking, whoa, there's even more to this. Because sometimes you hear people talk about head, hand, and heart, and Father, Spirit, and Son. And actually, the role of the prophet was to kind of understand and articulate what God's saying. The role of the priest to mediate, to carry the burdens of another, and hand to rule. God the Father, very much, we talk about the mind. The Spirit is very much kind of the emotive, and then we see the Son. Because, by the way, which member of the Trinity actually did the creation? The Bible tells us. The Son. Hand. Yeah, I actually had someone say this is a good way to understand kind of the different roles of the Spirit, or of God. That God the Father is author of all things. God the priest is the applier, that it helps us to see it and to know it, and God the Son is the accomplisher. He's the one that does it. You start seeing these themes, and you can say, well, okay, so maybe we actually are supposed to live as prophet, priest, and king. So this head, heart, and hand thing that we talk a lot about isn't just some kind of nifty language. So when Jesus says you're supposed to love God with your heart and your mind and your strength, He's actually saying, love God with what it fundamentally means to be human. Yeah. It's not just this new idea. He's like, love God with what it most means to be you. Okay. Last week, Kristen mentioned this. She referenced this. And I love this quote from The Weight of Glory, and this is part of where my title today, More Than Mere Bobbleheads, comes from. This comes out of The Weight of Glory. He says this. C.S. Lewis does. It's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all only in a nightmare. All day long we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them, that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all love, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. So those students that enter into our classrooms are not just ordinary students. They're not even mere mortals. They're in the image of God, created to live the offices of prophetess, priestess, and queen, or prophet, priest, and king. They're not mere mortals. And yet, unfortunately, in many of our schools, we treat them like they're bobbleheads. You know bobbleheads? They've just got these big old heads and really small hearts and bodies. We just say, just sit down and be quiet. And we don't spend enough effort to figure out, well, how do we engage the whole person? Schools notoriously say, well, we teach the whole child. Part of me wants to say, bull. If we treat them just like bobbleheads, and I think we need to do a better job of saying, how do we teach the whole child? In order to teach the whole child, you have to have a good theology of what the whole child is. Rational, relational, spiritual, moral, creative, prophet, priest, and king. I love this quote from Nick Wolterstorff. This comes out of his book, Educating for Life, which is basically just a bunch of his speeches on education he gave that were just put into a volume. He says, human beings are creatures for whom education is inescapable. It sounds very much like Ken Robinson, Sir Ken Robinson. It's like kids love to learn, they just don't like school. And it's like this, by nature, we want to learn because by nature, we're in God's image. All right, so let's deal with some kind of application stuff. So we need to teach and assess our students like we believe they're image bearers. That we believe they're rational, we believe they're relational, we believe they're spiritual, we believe they're moral, we believe they're creative. Not just teach, but also assess. Because I would actually say there is no such thing as teaching without thinking about assessment. My dad retired this past year, and he couldn't help getting frustrated with some of his peers over the years, and he showed me a screenshot he took of one of his peers, because from time to time he would look at how his students are doing, and he'd be curious, like, how are they doing in other teachers' classes? So he'd go online, and he'd be like 3/4 of the way through the semester, and he'd see a student with only 1 grade in a class. And I'm like, that's not teaching. Like, teaching assumes that you're doing some level of check-in to see how are they doing. And I mean, teaching and assessment, they are absolutely linked. But we need to think about, if I really believe they're rational beings, and rational doesn't just mean they're thinking. Rational assumes that they have the ability to make connections among ideas. If we're only treating them like parrots, we're not treating them like they're rational. Well, parrots, I mean, think about it. A parrot can say back to you almost anything. They can say back to you almost anything. If we only treat them like parrots, we're not treating them like rational beings. We're humans, image bearers. If we really believe they're rational, we're going to help them make connections. By the way, there's new pressure with AI. All the stuff that AI can help students do. I tend to think good teachers should not be scared of AI. But it should probably cause us to rethink the prompts we give our kids that require them to make connections that AI just can't generate for them. So, rather than just saying, tell me what Macbeth is all about, maybe we should be asking our students, how does Lady Macbeth's story help you better understand your story? Oh, now we're actually, that's going to be stuff that's going to be hard to generate because it's making it personal. You're connecting ideas. Or when I would teach Romans, I gave this to y'all a couple weeks ago. The Bono quote where he says, people either believe in karma or they believe grace. So when I would teach Romans, I would give them this quote from Bono and say, how is Bono dead on with Romans? And they're like, I doubt you could put that into AI, and they would, because you're asking them to make connections to things you're talking about, going through a rational process. We're relational beings. I hate group work. it. But once again, students are, the educational process is not just you and me, it's me and y'all. By the way, that's the way the Bible often in the New Testament, we translate as you, but good Southerners understand the word that's there is actually y'all. Christ came for y'all. We kind of make it individual me, but it's a group. And I think it's important for us to learn to understand that our students, they need to learn from each other. At a peer of mine, that we kind of worked on this little project, I'm like, I think I spend way too much time teaching at my kids. So what I want you to do is I want you to come to class and I want you to time what percentage of my class am I talking and what percentage of my class are they talking to me. And I said, I want to get it to 60-40, where they're talking to me 60% of the time and I'm talking to them 40% of the time. And I got to where I kept working, I got it down, and I said, now I want it to get to where they're talking to each other 60% of the time on topic. Because I wanted them to learn that they're a part of this learning community. It's not just me. Now, that changed the way I had to think about it as a facilitator. But assess them relationally because they're relational beings. So we need to actually put into practice, if we believe our students are rational, relational, but we teach them as only they're rational, we're minimizing some of these other things. Okay, teachers often, elementary teachers do this better. You give them something creative as they're learning. Okay, we're going to draw a picture of what you think Willy Wonka looked like. Okay, let's draw a picture. What do you think Willy Wonka would have looked like? Draw a picture. Okay, let's be creative. And the theorists say, oh, this helps them connect, abstract to concrete. Well, yes, that's true, but there's also a theology behind it that makes it work. So we need to think, how do we actually help students to connect creative things to what we're learning? When I taught Shakespeare, Much Ado About Nothing, I had my students translate one of my favorite scenes of that where Benedict and Beatrice are at each other. They're delivering insults to each other. I said, okay, so here's the thing. Divide them into groups. I want you groups to translate that scene into a common American vernacular, whether it's Ebonics or redneck or American gangster. And then watching these kids take Benedict's insult of Beatrice. Well, I think I know what Shakespeare's saying. How would a redneck say the same thing? Now they understood what Shakespeare was saying. But they had to be creative. And by the way, that's involving a whole lot of things. Spiritual, how do we get our students, how do we make them move to talk and worship in learning them? Once again, it's easy for us to just focus on the rational, but we need to think of relational ways to connect with them, spiritual ways to connect with them, moral ways to connect with them, creative ways to connect with them. Work with your peers. Find something creative that allows you to help access those things. Same thing goes for this idea of being prophet, priest, and king. Okay, so this yeah, something just fell off there. Okay, well, it's kind of like this moss, and it kind of, yeah. Okay, so we have this idea of king here. This is pretty good. So king, dominion. As a teacher, what would it look like to your kids as though you believe they're kings and queens? Once again, God gave them dominion. So what would that look like with you as teachers? If you really believe that, theologically, pedagogically believe that they are kings and queens. Any ideas?
Give them autonomy on certain things.
Yeah. Give them more ability to choose. Give them autonomy. Give them the ability to actually own it. I mean, have y'all ever heard of Hoag's ladder? It's kind of in educational theorist circles. I could tell you, H-O-A-G, Hoag's ladder. None of this would be a surprise to you. Hoag did some research on 36 hours how much of the stuff that has been learned is retained. And once again, no surprise. If they've only heard it, it's like 5%. I mean, it's like hardly anything. If they've heard it and then seen it, it's like 15%. Like, okay, now we're starting to like all the way up and, seen it, heard it, written things down, like there's all these maybe recited it back, okay, all those things. So 5% is the lowest. Any ideas which one goes all the way up to 88%? 36 hours later, they will retain 88% of it. What would cause a student to retain 88% of it? It's more than that. Not just practicing it. They taught it themselves. If a student, y'all know this too, when you've taught things, like it's just in there for a long time. And I'm actually kind of shocked that 88% is that low. But there's a risk there because you give them the ability to teach it. You're not sure what they're going to say. But once again, theologically, if you believe they're prophet, priest, and king, okay, prophet is kind of just speak back, speak truth. But king, like give them some autonomy, give them freedom to own some of their learning, to have control in it. And once again, the theorists, they've been saying this for decades and decades. They didn't just stumble on or create some truth out of thin air. It's true because of what we believe theologically. And that's one of the things that I think is important. A lot of these things that you learn as teachers or theorists talk about, it's not rocket science. The reason it works is because of what the Bible tells us about who we are. So if you're doing things that are creative, I want you to be encouraged to even do more stuff that's creative. If you're doing things that are relational, do even more of it. If you're doing things that access, and maybe ask some of those questions of yourself and your peers, how am I accessing this creative component or spiritual component? How am I nurturing awe and wonder? One of my favorite teachers would come to class and he would just play beautiful music and say, what does this do to you? Just to nurture sort of a sense of the other. This idea of prophet, priest, and king, at times, how do we bring out the emotions in some of these things? And sometimes you'll see your pastors or your friends, like they're teaching good things and they start crying. I was sort of a jock in high school. I liked history and I liked art. And I did pretty well in math and science. I had no interest in literature. Like zero. And you've already heard me quote lots of different literature stuff. I had no interest in it. But my AP English teacher my senior year would weep reading to us poetry from John Donne. And I'm like, I don't even know anything about John Donne, but I need to figure out who this guy is because it's doing something crazy to Mrs. Herring. And she began to help us to see the beauty of these things, which is nurturing, that spiritual component, that sense of awe and wonder, but also at times for us to get at the heart of our child. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why I think it's vital that we have things in our schools that help us get to the hearts of our child. Here at Covenant, they've got morning gathering. You listen to the kids sing. Central, I love. I can only go to the schools I see. At Central, you gather everyone in the gym and you have chapel and you watch all these kids singing, and because it's like a hard tile floor, the sound just gets really loud in there. It's like, but that, like, you're getting at their hearts. And we used to, at Central when I was there, I don't know if y'all do this, we ended every chapel the exact same song. Do y'all do that still? Like we had the exact same song at the end of every single chapel service. And one day I was kind of standing outside the office talking to a parent, and I heard kind of around the hall this last song that we would wrap every chapel up with. It's basically taken from a poem, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ beside me. It was a beautiful kind of like, let's go into our day with this. And I walk around the corner, and this girl's walking back to her classroom after getting a drink of water, back to her classroom singing this song. And I imagine that she wasn't consciously thinking about the fact she was singing this song. It was just in her. It was just in there. Like, because it becomes such part of the accessing of the heart of our kids, it was kind of subconsciously just there. How do we nurture the heart as well as the head of our students and give them the ability to control things like the king? Build lesson plans and classroom management structures where we give students the ability to have some ownership over classroom management stuff. Wow, that's a risk. But I've seen teachers that master this kind of thing where they give students kind of some freedom. Where I was actually observing a teacher not too long ago, and the students just understood that if they wanted to go to the bathroom, they didn't have to ask for permission. They would just go and take this kind of like little token off that was on a little rope. They would take it off and they'd go to the bathroom. And it just was like, it was understood. That kid took it, went to the bathroom, has to bring it back, put it there. And it just gave the kid like some, I trust you. And I kind of was like, pretty cool. But even build lesson plans. Like, how am I going to, over the course of the next unit, access some of the creative components of my students or some of the relational components of my students? How am I going to access some of their king nature or prophet nature or priest nature? By the way, it takes a little bit of kind of forethought because it doesn't naturally just happen. We often default to what's easiest to us. Like I said, I'm not good at group work. I hated group work. I hated assessing even more. But I think there's a theology behind why that might be good. Oh, think about learning styles in different backgrounds. Why is it that Christian schools, I would argue, should be on the forefront of figuring out how to do a better job of allowing kids with learning styles to flourish in our schools? It's another one of my pet peeves. A lot of kids, if they've got big learning styles, they have to go to the public schools. Why is it that Christian schools, I think, should be on the forefront of figuring out how to help students with different learning styles flourish?
We understand that God created them so uniquely special just the way they are.
Yeah.
We embrace that.
Yeah, we embrace that, just the way they are. They're image bearers. Why is it that schools that believe students are image bearers have to send off a child to a public school that doesn't believe they're image bearers? Why is it the public school has invested more resources? And you're like, well, it's expensive. Well, I think we got to figure out how to fund that. And different backgrounds, students come to our schools with different backgrounds. Christians, once again, it does not matter what part of town you grew up in, you're an image bearer. It does not matter what your learning style is, you're an image bearer. And we've got to do everything we can as teachers to make sure that our students don't kind of rank themselves and their worth based around things that have nothing to do with being image bearers. I'll even say this. As best I can tell from studying the history of American education, grades, as we use grades today in our country as kind of like sticks and carrots, the grading process that we use in our schools, and when we start using it, even from elementary school on, was essentially designed by a guy named B.F. Skinner. If you get into educational kind of studies, B.F. Skinner is one of the fathers of American education along with John Dewey. B.F. Skinner's most famous book was entitled Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And in the book, he is saying that one of the fatal flaws of teachers is that we assume kids have freedom and dignity. That's a flaw. He's like, they don't have freedom, they don't have dignity, they're just complex organisms. And what you need to do as a teacher is to figure out what would be the stimulus that's going to get them to produce whatever you want them to do. And you just need to figure out what the right stick and carrot is in order to get what you want. And he says, bring me a child and I will make him do what I want. Our grading system came out of that. And in many ways, it dehumanizes our kids. And also, then we get this feeling of, I've got to treat every kid the same, which I think that's also dangerous. Because once again, to your point, Kim, they're all created in different ways. I had this student, if you were to come and observe my Bible class I had him in, sophomore, if you were to observe him, sit in the back of the room and observe class, you would say, he's got to be an A-level student, because his answers were spot on all class long. If you were to grade his written assessments, you would think he's never been in a class a day in his life. And I was like, I don't understand what's going on. Parents refused to get him tested, which I got issues there too. So I said, well, hey, why don't you come by class or by my office after class today, and I just want to kind of go through, before I even read his answers, I just want to go through the questions with you and write down what you say. He was flawless in his spoken version, and something was happening when he tried to write it on paper, blew up. And I remember talking about this with my peers. My peers were like, well, that's not treating him fair. And I'm like, I don't care. He knows truth. Why in the world would I not allow the truth that's in his head and his heart to be out there? Because I believe he's an image bearer. He's an image bearer. Who cares if this image bearer can't write it on paper very well? I don't care. There's a theology underneath this where we've got to figure out, how do we speak to this? How do we build programs? Westminster down the road, they've got this robotics club that's sponsored by Boeing. At least it was when I was there years ago. And you've got kids that are in the robotics club that are like, and I mean this affectionately, they're geeks. They're not going to flourish in class, they're not going to flourish on a football field, but they're flourishing in robotics because that's where they found a home. So as schools, where are we going to put places and programs together where these kids can actually use the giftings God's given them, and then we can see them flourish? That's one of the reasons why I think that schools still should have some kind of sports. They should still have some kind of, because that allows the kids to flourish in ways where they actually may not in our classrooms. And then this psalm, I always like to go there when we talk about what we're created as humans to be, Psalm 8. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. You've made him a little lower than heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You've given him dominion over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, also the beasts of the field, the birds of heaven, the fish of the sea, whatever pass along the path of the sea. Crowned him with glory and honor. What is man that you are mindful of him? And these are the students that come into our classrooms. And I feel like as Christian educators, we've got to do a better job. When we say we believe they're image bearers, we need to do a better job of articulating what that means. And not just taking it for granted. And say that Christians have to be at the very forefront of making sure that we're thinking, how do we allow these students to flourish with all of the dignity God gave them? You remember, as C.S. Lewis says, you've never met a mere mortal. Never. That person that drove you crazy driving over here today, not a mere mortal. Prophet, priest, and king, created in the image of the infinite personal God, has profound value, even though that person can't drive to save his life. Image bearer. And our students are image bearers. And I know it's hard at times to remember that, but we probably need to pause every single day and say, these little rascals that are coming into my classroom today, they're created in the image of God. And they're little prophets and priests and kings, and you're driving me mad, but you're a prophet, priest, and king. And then to think through our lesson plans and all those things. How am I accessing this stuff when it comes to my kids? And Lord willing, that helps us to better make sense of the world in light of the gospel, and for them too as well. All right. Grid question number 3 down. Like I told you, this is my favorite one because I feel like if Christians would just do this, if Christian schools would just do this, I think people would be flocking to our schools because they would see that what we're doing is truly unique. All right, I'll see y'all next week. We're halfway done. Next week we're going to deal with ethics, and then we get to creation, fall, and redemption.